Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Brian Lee Crowley. I'm the Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and it is my immense pleasure to welcome you to this special event entitled Geopolitics Unbound, Confronting Authoritarianism from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. And we are doubly delighted to welcome you as this is the first large in-person event the Institute has been able to host since the pandemic. And I'm sure that we're all happy to be able to engage in these important discussions in person and actually seeing the faces of the people that we're talking to. Not only are we grateful to you for attending and showing that there is life after COVID, but we equally want to express our gratitude to the Embassy of the United States here in Ottawa, which has graciously and generously supported this event and made it possible for you all to be here today. MLI deeply values our engagement with the Embassy and the State Department and celebrates our shared commitment to a robust US-Canada relationship that, in tandem with our friends in Europe, Asia, and beyond, can and must meet the challenges the world throws every day in the path of the liberal democracies. On to the topic of the day. For several years now, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute has been providing calm, reasoned, but urgent and worrisome analysis to Canadians and their governments on the threats and challenges posed by foreign adversaries such as the Kremlin and the Chinese Communist Party. Through their actions, these adversaries directly threaten the values and the interests that we hold so dear in Canada, such as the rule of law, the freedom to settle disputes peacefully, and most importantly, the existence of an open society of ideas and free people. This threat, of course, is not exercised uniquely on Canada. It's a global challenge, one that touches our closest friends, many of whom are here today, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And that alone explains the strong representation of the diplomatic community here in the room today. I understand we have 7 or 8 ambassadors, 7 or 8 deputy heads of mission from a variety of countries around the world. Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine provides a poignant reminder of the dangers posed by the Kremlin to the democratic world. Our Central and East European allies, who are on the front lines in facing down the sustained Russian challenges to European and North Atlantic security and stability, have been raising this alarm for years. Russia's bad behavior in Georgia, Moldova, Crimea, and elsewhere were not enough, however, fully to engage our attention. It took the full-scale invasion of Ukraine for people here to accept that illusions of compromise and negotiation would never contain Russia's ambitions. Canadians are now ready to hear that Russia's threat is not only one of physical threats and intimidation. We have been tireless and forceful in drawing attention to Russia's efforts to subvert our democratic institutions through disinformation and hybrid warfare, as well as the threat posed by Russian revisionism to the rules-based international order through our publications, op-eds, panels, and outreach to policymakers. And here at home, we at MLI have been the leading voice for a stronger, more capable, and principled Canadian policy against Russian revanchism and in support of our allies. I should note that our adversaries recognize the importance and effectiveness of MLI's work. The Kremlin has sanctioned not just 1 or 2, but 5 of our senior fellows in recent months, banning them from entering Russia indefinitely and spoiling their plans for summer holidays in Siberia. We have hopes that several more of our senior fellows will follow, and in fact, I have at least one of my senior fellows who's promised to write to Putin to complain about the invidious position he has been put in, given that I have not been sanctioned and I'm deeply jealous. Other authoritarian regimes, such as the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, publicly attack MLI in their statements. MLI is probably unique among Canadian public policy institutions in that it has drawn the ire of both the Kremlin and the Chinese Communist Party for its principled and unwavering stance on human rights, on democracy, and in defense of Canadian values and interests. They are clearly paying attention to what we have to say And our view is that this is the best possible evidence of the effectiveness of our work. We're proud of MLI's record of speaking truth to power, whether in Ottawa, Moscow, Beijing, or elsewhere, and calling out these threats to our society, a society that generations of Canadians have fought hard to protect and nurture. We couldn't be happier to be taking up the torch in this generation and for those yet to come. More, of course, needs to be done, and rest assured, more will be done in the months and years ahead. Next, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Catherine Brooker, who is the Deputy Head of Mission from, and I understand in the absence of the Ambassador, you are the Chargé today. So the Chargé d'Affaires from the Embassy of the United States to Canada, who has graciously agreed to provide some opening comments. Let me say, by the way, that I am determined, I am a long-standing opponent of long and boring introductions of speakers. We have circulated a handout with bios of all our distinguished speakers, every one of whom attended excellent schools and has had a distinguished career where they do fascinating things, okay? Otherwise, trust me, they wouldn't be here, okay? So if you want to know more about the speakers, there's a handout on the table. Please may I invite the Chargé d'Affaires from the US Embassy, Catherine Brooker, to address the group.
All right, good morning, and thank you, Brian, for sparing everybody a rundown of my career. The only thing that's more boring and long than listening to it will be reading it. But I would like to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, I know you go by MLI, for inviting me to speak today. And I'm really honored to be among such distinguished company. And I'm grateful to MLI for convening this group for what I'm sure will be enlightening and thought-provoking discussions. Russia's unprovoked and horrific attack on Ukraine serves as a stark reminder of the challenges authoritarian regimes pose to international peace, security, and the rules-based international order. But Russia's aggression has also demonstrated the power of international alliances and collective action, and reinforced the importance of working with our partners across the globe to defend shared values. Over the course of my diplomatic career, I've been posted all around the world. The war in Ukraine has prompted me to reflect on two of my tours in particular. As the US Consul General in Leipzig, Germany, the only US diplomatic mission in the former East Germany, and in Vienna, Austria, working for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE. My consular district in Leipzig included the town of Fulda in Thuringia. I'm sure this audience is well aware of the Cold War history of what's known as the Fulda Gap, a lowland corridor that was the shortest route from the border of East and West Germany to the heart of West Germany. As the most obvious route for a Soviet ground attack on West Germany, the Gap was heavily militarized for decades by both NATO and Warsaw Pact countries, with numerous observation posts fewer than 100 yards apart. As someone remarked during a visit there, if the East Bloc troops made it through here, it would be a straight shot to Frankfurt. I visited Point Alpha at the Fulda Gap many times during my years in Germany, and it always caused me to consider both the possibilities and the precariousness of peace. To quote the great American writer and humorist Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. We can't help but see parallels between the Cold War and the current situation in Ukraine. Russia's attack is forcing us to once again confront the very real, very dangerous possibility of a direct conventional military conflict between NATO and Russian forces, and Russia's nuclear saber rattling has been as irresponsible as it's been disturbing. Our response to the current crisis will shape geopolitical norms and the world order for decades, just as our choices and actions did during the Cold War. My posting to the OSCE in Vienna reinforced for me the importance of working together as a global community to confront universal challenges. While not without its difficulties, consensus can be tough to achieve even at the best of time and among the closest of friends. In Vienna, I saw firsthand the benefits and positive impact of like-minded states cooperating to achieve shared goals. And more specifically to the OSCE, I saw the importance of multilateral organizations that focus on confidence and security building measures. This work is as essential and it must be constant, because even as we confront the war in Ukraine, there are already disturbing rumblings in the Balkans. This multilateral cooperation is evident again among the United States, Canada, and so many other nations to support Ukraine in its heroic fight to defend its freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The threat posed by rising authoritarianism defies simple solutions, and I believe that whatever our approach, we must undertake it together. While the war in Ukraine is dominating international headlines, Russia is far from our only geopolitical challenge. President Biden has been clear about the importance of the Indo-Pacific region to the United States, and Secretary Blinken has called the rise of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, the defining challenge of our age. China's actions in Hong Kong, its rhetoric regarding Taiwan, its strategic investments across Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific, and its increasingly assertive behavior in the Arctic reminds us that while Russia is a hurricane, the PRC is climate change. The increasing alignment of Moscow and Beijing, driven in part by a mutual desire to counter Washington and the West, adds a new element to an already complex dynamic. US and Canadian policies and our approaches to emerging challenges require careful and deliberate consideration of complicated issues from all angles. That's just one of the reasons conferences like this one are so important. I hope your discussions today are frank, grounded in our shared values, and open to creative and out-of-the-box thinking. So thank you very much again for inviting me today, and I wish you, as I say in French, bonne continuation.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, I'd like to invite Rob Oliphant to the podium. Rob Oliphant is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and has served as the Member of Parliament for Don Valley West since 2008.
Thanks very much, Brian, and thank you to the Institute and to everyone who is here. And as Catherine said, all protocols observed, Your Excellencies, and all of those who wish to be Your Excellency in the future. It's really, I want to thank the Institute for bringing us together. We haven't had many opportunities to do that in these last 2 years, and this is really an important discussion at an important time. And I also want to thank the Embassy of the United States for sponsoring this event and for allowing this kind of work to happen. And I will start by saying that I don't think there's ever been a time where Canada and the United States have been as lockstep in our approach to the issues that are under discussion today. It is so important that we look at these issues in the geopolitical world that we're in right now and look at it from the lens of Western, democratic, liberal countries and bring together our ideas, bring together our thoughts. There will always be differences in our approaches, but there's never been, I don't think, such harmonization of our approach during the current invasion of Russia into Ukraine. This theme is timely, it's an important theme. And I think that all of us come here with a certain idea that our world is at a precipice right now, and we are looking at what the future will be and how liberal democracies will approach it. Our eyes are first, of course, on the illegal invasion of Russia into Ukraine. It's an unprovoked invasion, and it is probably the greatest threat to global security that we are undergoing right now. The rules-based international order was created by all of us, including by Russia, and it was meant to ensure respect for sovereignty within internationally recognized borders. Putin's actions have violated decades of trust that has been built upon this international order. And right now, Ukrainian people are fighting for their country, their democracy, their sovereign right to choose their own path. They're also fighting for our way of life. They're also fighting for our independence and our respect of the international rules-based order. And we support Ukraine in its legitimate efforts of self-defense. This support, obviously, from Canada's perspective and from our allies and like-minded countries, includes humanitarian and financial assistance, military equipment, training, and in concert with other countries, an unprecedented package of sanctions against Russia and those complicit in this war. Those sanctions are having an effect. Our goal is, of course, to lift up Ukraine in every way possible to level that playing field militarily, but also to suppress, to suffocate Russia as it continues its illegal invasion. With our allies and our partners, we've responded with an unprecedented level of coordination. That coordination began late last year, continued through January, in anticipation of a possible invasion. And as you see those sanctions that have been rolled out, they have been done in a coordinated fashion that really has involved a tremendous effort from our officials, from people who have been in constant conversation with each other. And I want to really commend officials in the United States and in Canada and in our like-minded countries for their constant 7 days a week action in regard to making sure that we are engaged both at the military level, but also at that economic level. Besides supporting Ukraine, we have to ensure that Russia does not broaden its ambitions for territorial conquest. Canada and other NATO allies are therefore deploying additional forces to bolster NATO's deterrence and defense posture in Eastern Europe. The invasion has created a seismic shift within Europe that will redefine the security landscape, possibly for decades to come. Not the least of that is the really historic announcement by Finland and Sweden of their intention to join NATO. This is incredibly important as we look at how like-mindeds join with each other, both with our resources, but also with our aspirations, and recognize that territorial integrity is important and that we need to defend each other, not only ourselves. Those two countries had a long history of non-alignment, military non-alignment. And as a result of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, he's drawn a line in the sand and countries are standing up. And we're ready to receive them. Canada has been very clear about NATO's open door policy, and we will accept them as soon as possible. It's clear that President Putin's unjustified and unprovoked invasion is an attack on international law, on the UN Charter, on democracy, on freedom, and human rights. And while he's waged a war of military aggression, he's also waged a war of disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. War in the 21st century is becoming more and more about finding ways to counter that disinformation and work together with like-mindeds to ensure that people have the right information, the right knowledge at the right time. Russia's leadership bears the blame for all the global impacts of this war. Those impacts include energy impacts, supply chain challenges, food insecurity, price inflation, and a growing humanitarian crisis. Last week, I was in Egypt, in Morocco. 2 weeks ago, before that, I was in Senegal and Nigeria. Food insecurity, which was already a real issue related to climate change, weather, and other issues following the pandemic, have been exacerbated by this war. People will die. There is a hunger in this world that will not be satisfied easily or quickly, and it is as a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. We have to be very clear when we're talking with our friends about that this is not about our response to Putin. It is a direct result of Russia's aggression. We need to work together, just as we're working together to militarily support Ukraine and also to suppress Russia, but also to feed the world. And that will be the next challenge that we will see in these coming weeks and months. The international community will be challenged, but must stand together on the side of international law, on humanitarian assistance, and resist brute territorial aggression. The Russian invasion of Ukraine underscores the need to reinforce the rules-based international order globally, including with partners in the Indo-Pacific. I love that line about climate change, about the hurricane and climate change. I've written it down. You will hear it again and again from me. I'll give you credit for it. The Indo-Pacific obviously is home to 60% of the world's population. Shipping lanes there carry 1/3 of the world's bulk cargo, at least 2/3 of the world's oil. The importance of the Indo-Pacific goes well beyond commercial and security dynamics. Half of Canada's foreign-born population is from that region, and fully almost 20% of Canadians trace their heritage to the Indo-Pacific. These are enduring links, and it means that Canada is there, needs to be there, and needs to be mindful of the changing specter of opportunities that are, as well as the challenges. Canada's evolving policy framework for China is one critical approach to our need to be involved in this region. With our partners, we need to actively support Indo-Pacific regional security and stability to ensure a favorable security environment. However, increasing authoritarianism in the region is challenging the rules-based international order. We have seen it, as has been said, in Hong Kong, in rhetoric about Taiwan, in the suppression of human rights for people in semi-autonomous regions like Tibet. We are seeing that around the region with an aggression that needs to be monitored closely and dealt with seriously. Acts of coercive diplomacy, including arbitrary detention and economic coercion towards smaller states, are serious challenges to established rules and norms. Canada will work with all states in the region, large and small, to promote these interests. In Ukraine, in the Indo-Pacific, throughout the world, Canada will work with allies and partners to promote the rules-based international order. As you know, Canada is working under our minister, the Honorable Melanie Joly, on an Indo-Pacific strategy that will look at exactly Canada's role in that economically, culturally, militarily, strategically, to ensure that Canada and Canadians are positioned well in that part of the world. We're also looking at Canada's position in Africa, and my mandate includes developing a strategy for Africa, a foreign policy strategy, which looks at the relationship that Canada has to the African countries, also in light of both Russia and China's increasing footprint in that area. Last week, I attended the Coalition Against Daesh, and you see the work of terrorists expanding beyond Iraq and Syria into Africa, and through mercenaries such as the Wagner Group, which is a Russian-based paramilitary organization at work in the Sahel. Canada needs to be mindful of this and needs to be very, very assertive in our approach to helping fragile or emerging democracies continue to be part of the international rules-based order and become liberal democracies as we would hope they would become. We must continue to protect the UN Charter's bedrock principles. We must ensure that multilateral institutions are effective, accountable, and that they deliver the best results and benefits for citizens and countries around the world. Not only our countries, but around the world. In doing so, we'll have to bring together not just democracies, but the widest possible coalition of states. At the same time, Canada will work with like-minded partners to uphold liberal democratic values. We must especially protect those institutions and processes that support human rights, democracy, gender equality. As you know, Minister Joly is currently leading that development for an integrated Indo-Pacific strategy. I'll be working on the African strategy. We continue to work with allies and like-mindeds at the OSCE, at the UN, and other multilateral bodies to ensure that Canada's presence is not only heard, but is helpful. Canada is also committed to strengthening our defense posture. This work is being led by Minister Anand in the Department of National Defense with a focus on modernizing Canada's continental defense capabilities and updating Canada's defense strategy. I think our eyes are wide open in a way that they have not been for the last several decades since the end of the Cold War. We need to be vigilant, we need to be aggressive, we need to be careful, and we need to be mindful and work with our like-minded partners. Along with our allies, Canada will also support the adoption of new NATO strategic conception at the NATO Leaders Summit in Madrid next month. This will help guide NATO's work during these increasingly turbulent times. Russia's act of war clearly demonstrated the value, not only of the international rules-based order, but about working together, about engaging together, about sharing intelligence, and about being cooperative in every aspect of our foreign policy. Ukraine's resolve and international response to the invasion are being watched the world over. We will be judged at our response. The international community's substantial support to Ukraine should be instructive to would-be aggressors. They should understand that many nations around the world are prepared to stand up for sovereignty, democracy, human rights, international law. We'll stand together. Thank you for your attention today. I wish you all the very best in this discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. It's a delight and an encouragement to us at the Institute to see our two governments in both the United States and in Canada standing shoulder to shoulder and cooperating so fully and so effectively in responding to Russia's challenge to the international order. I won't take all the credit at MLI for this, but I'll take some small share of the credit for having created a climate of public opinion in which, when Russia fully revealed its intentions, it was possible for governments here in Canada to take the appropriate steps. I'd now like to invite Marcus Colga. There's Marcus. You may remember in my opening remarks, I mentioned that 5 of our senior fellows have been sanctioned by Russia. Leading the list is my good friend and colleague, Marcus Colga, who is not only a senior fellow at the Institute, but also the head of DisinfoWatch, and I think one of the most articulate, thoughtful, and knowledgeable voices in Canada on the dangers posed by Russia generally, but in particular, the disinformation and misinformation efforts of Russia to disrupt, democratic institutions within Canada and the rest of the democratic world. Marcus, will you come up and perhaps we can invite the members of his panel to also come up, and Marcus, you can get things underway.
My name is Marcus Colga. I am your surprise guest moderator today, filling in for my dear friend and colleague, Balkan Devlin, who's come down with a touch of COVID. I know that he'll be watching at home, so Balkan, please get well, and I'll do my very best to try and fill your very big shoes. Ladies and gentlemen, let me sort of try and set the stage for our next panel. The world today is quite different than the one we lived in before February 24th. Over 3 short months, Vladimir Putin has clearly succeeded in doing the exact opposite of what he set out to do on February 24th. He's managed to strengthen Western unity and resolve against his insatiable appetite for conflict. Yesterday, Finland's parliament, a nation that has spent the last 80 years bending over backwards to avoid any provocation of Russia, voted 188 to 8 in favor of joining NATO. They're of course joined by Sweden, which has been a neutral state for nearly 100 years. And just this morning, I was watching CNN here in the hotel, and indeed the Swedish and Finnish ambassadors submitted their formal applications to Jens Stoltenberg. McDonald's has permanently pulled its operations in Russia, symbolically turning back the clocks on Russian isolation to the 1980s. Vladimir Putin has indeed committed to restoring the Soviet Union, but no one expected him to drag his nation all the way back to the Brezhnev era. Putin's offensives against Kiev and northeastern Ukraine have failed, and Russian casualties are mounting on all fronts. Meanwhile, Western sanctions have prevented Putin from repairing his damaged weapons or building new ones. That's the good news. Yet rockets continue to rain down on cities in western Ukraine. And the West continues to fund Putin's war to the tune of nearly $1 billion per day in oil and gas revenues. On the Arctic, 1 year ago today, Sergei Lavrov unequivocally stated that it belongs to Russia and that its rapid militarization in the Arctic is in fact legitimate. This was coupled with a Russian claim to all the resources underneath the Arctic Sea. 3 days after Lavrov's comments, Vladimir Putin warned that Russia will, quote, knock the teeth out of anyone who tries to take a piece of Russia in the context of these claims. If there was any hope that the Russian people would rise up against the war, over 15,000 Russians have been arrested since early March for criticizing it, including prominent Russian human rights and democracy activist Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was detained 3 weeks ago and now faces up to 15 years in prison for criticizing Putin's war. To discuss all of this and where all of this is headed in the coming months and years are leading global experts on Russia, transatlantic security, and the Arctic. With us today, on my left, is Angela Stent. She is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and co-chairs the Hewitt Forum on Post-Soviet Affairs. She was a member of the senior advisory panel for NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, Admiral Stavridis and General Breedlove. She is the author of Putin's World, which looks at Putin's paranoid worldview and wrote in February of this year that the invasion of Ukraine was always in the cards for Vladimir Putin. Beside her is Lauren Speranza. She is the Director of Transatlantic Defense and Security at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, one of my favorite transatlantic think tanks. She founded and leads CEPA's Defense Tech Initiative. Her expertise includes defense and deterrence in Europe, emerging defense technologies, Russian and Chinese hybrid threats, and NATO's future. She's also written extensively on NATO-EU relations, as well as Nordic-Baltic, Black Sea, and Mediterranean security. Michael Kimmage is a professor at Catholic University of America and a fellow at the German Marshall Front. Professor Kimmage specializes in the history of the Cold War and 20th century U.S. diplomatic and intellectual history and U.S.-Russian relations since 1991. From 2014 to 2016, he served on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff at the U.S. State Department, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. His forthcoming book is titled The Decline of the West, An American Story. And last but certainly not least, our own Heather Exner-Perot, who is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Heather has over 15 years of experience in Indigenous and Northern economic development, governance, health, and post-secondary education affairs. In addition to her role at MLI, she is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Now, instead of going through introductory remarks, we're going to get right into the discussion this morning. And we'll go through 3 rounds of moderated questions. Then I'll ask for any of you who have questions to step up to the mic. We've also had some questions submitted earlier, and I think someone will have a mic after our initial round of questions. And then we'll take a look at where we're at. I know we've got 2 hours scheduled. We may cut it a little bit short. This is our first in-person meeting since COVID started, so maybe we can have a little bit of extra time for some schmoozing and networking. Our first question, of course, let's get to that. This goes to all of you. What do all of you see as the primary challenge Russia poses to NATO and our allies in Europe and beyond the next 3 to 5 years? And we'll start with Angela.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcus, and thank you, MLI, for putting on this conference and inviting me. And it's wonderful to see real people and not look at a screen. I'm still getting used to it. You pointed out that Putin really is a strategic genius. As a result of this terrible war in Ukraine, you have the Ukrainian people united 1,000% behind President Zelensky, by the way, whose popularity rates were quite low before it began. You have a united Western alliance, the United States, Canada, Europe, and then, of course, our Asian partners too, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, who've gone along with these very tough sanctions, and Finland and Sweden are about to join NATO, and even Switzerland is now questioning whether it should remain neutral. So he's really accomplished a lot in about 80 days. So I see there are a number of challenges, obviously, from Putin and Putin's war. And I think the first one is both Putin and Xi Jinping talk about wanting a post-West global order. But for the Xi Jinping, and I know we're going to have another panel talking about this, this global order would have some rules. For Putin, this is very much a disruptive global order. If it's not an order in which Russia can dictate the rules, he's not interested in it. And therefore, he's trying, even with this war and its consequences, to set everyone off balance. We have no idea where he'll go next. So this kind of idea of constant disruption and acting as a spoiler, it's something we've seen in Putin all along, but I think it's become much more intense and exacerbated since this war began. Obviously, he undertook this war because he wanted to subjugate Ukraine, because he wanted to establish a Russian sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. He wanted to create a new Slavic union of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, possibly northern Kazakhstan, and possibly extend Russia's influence beyond that to the former Warsaw Pact states. If you look at the treaties, the treaty was presented to NATO in December. He's accomplished none of that yet. But of course, terrible destruction in Ukraine. And the fact that Mariupol has now surrendered does mean that Russia does have this land bridge now to Crimea and has taken over more territory. And he underestimated, when he began this war, he underestimated the Ukrainian will to fight. He overestimated the prowess of the Russian military. We really have to re-examine all of the ideas I think we had about how well Russia had modernized its military. And he, of course, underestimated Western unity and the willingness to sacrifice for these very tough sanctions that we have imposed on Russia. So this is all, and we know, we can see all these mistakes, we can see the colossal blunders that have been made. But obviously, this war, however it ends, will have major consequences for NATO in the next 3 to 5 years. And so I just wanted to say a little bit about that. What will those consequences be? I think it depends on how the war ends, and indeed if it ends. So I think we have to accept the fact that this could go on for a long time. You could have periods of a ceasefire and maybe a retreat or a frozen conflict, and then it could start again. And that will depend, I think, how long Putin stays in power. We don't know. There are all of the rumors about his health, about his mental state, whatever. As far as we know, he's still in the Kremlin, and he's still calling the shots and really not consulting with very many other people. But still, I think for the next few years, we can assume that this conflict will not be over. And so the challenge will be to continue supporting Ukraine and then figuring out also how we help reconstruct Ukraine, even if the war is still going on. Russia will emerge from this war weaker. We can already see that. The sanctions that we've imposed will really bite much more in the fall, maybe next year, with all the export control sanctions. Russia's feeling the pinch now a little bit, but it will feel it much more, particularly if the European Union can get its members to agree to stop importing Russian oil, because we are obviously still fueling the Russian war chest. Russia has always been a great power or a superpower only because of its military might, never because of its economic prowess. That military might is diminished, and yet it is still a potential threat. And as long as Russia remains a nuclear superpower, it will and retains its permanent seat and veto on the United Nations Security Council, it will still be able to to exercise a lot of power globally, to act as a great power, even if it's weaker. And so it will remain a threat to NATO. So far, we haven't actually seen Russia deploy the full extent, potentially, of its cyber power against Ukraine and other countries. We'll see what happens with Finland and Sweden in this interim period as they wait to join the NATO alliance. So NATO's immediate challenge in the future will still be to contain, the Russian aggression, and as it is now, and as it will be in the future. And I think my final point on this is some people have argued that this is the time now to reimagine Euro-Atlantic security architecture, that the architecture that we've had for the last 30 years is clearly no longer functional because of this Russian unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. But the problem is, after this war, how can we possibly engage Russia on these issues? I mean, the very issue that made it so difficult in the 1990s to create a security architecture in which Russia had a stake remain today and have really been intensified by this conflict. And that is that Russia's view of its role in Europe is really still one where it should exercise, by Russian accounts, influence and even control over its neighborhood and even beyond into Central and Eastern Europe. And so I see that as a major challenge going forward. I don't think it's going to be possible to re-examine that. And so I think we come back to the question that we've been asking at least since the end of the Cold War, also before, and that is, where does Russia belong in Europe? And we just don't find a satisfactory answer to that.
Well, thank you so much for that, Angela. I also want to remind everyone that Vladimir Putin just last summer changed the constitution of his own country, and this would allow him to potentially stay on as president until at least 2036. And I say at least 2036 because if he gets to that point, you can bet that he will change the constitution again and stay there much longer.
He doesn't even need to change the constitution.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't. Lauren, your views.
Thanks so much, Marcus, and thank you to Jonathan and to MLI for having me. It's an impossible task to follow, Dr. Stunt, but I will pick up on some of the points that you raised. I think first, Brian mentioned in his opening as well just kind of where the alliance is, and I think Mr. Oliphant mentioned that the strategic concept, which is coming up at the NATO summit next month already. As all of you know, the last strategic concept, which is kind of NATO's guiding document, is from 2010, and the language sort of described Russia as on track to be a strategic partner. Now, obviously, we have very clear evidence that Russia is an adversary, and so I think the first challenge to NATO is actually to put some meaningful language in the strategic concept that will recast the relationship with Russia and give the alliance, the full mandate to do what it needs to do, and to frame that language in a way that can last a decade, as that's what traditionally the strategic concepts have done. But one kind of, sort of bureaucratic challenge that may emerge from this is that we might have to actually update our strategies more often because the environment that we're in is so volatile and is changing because of Russia's actions. But I think there are three kind of primary threats that I see from Russia to NATO from the NATO perspective. So one is what Dr. Stunt already mentioned about the conventional military threat. Obviously, Russia has the willingness to go kinetic, and I think a way that the West, by and large, underestimated, despite having watched what they did in Georgia and elsewhere in the past. But as you mentioned, that force hasn't proved as lethal or as credible as we thought, as demonstrated by the conventional military failures of Russia and Ukraine. Russia has showcased serious shortcomings when it comes to the way they train and organize, their command and control, and their leadership and morale of the force, and also the way they do supply and logistics and maintenance. So this, of course, doesn't mean that Russia hasn't inflicted terrible damage on innocent Ukrainians, but they have been forced to change their conventional military objectives because they couldn't achieve them. in the face of what should have been, by the numbers, an inferior force. So now we heard France and a few others coming out yesterday saying, actually, maybe there isn't a conventional military threat to Russia, and NATO doesn't have to be spending all of this money and doing all these things to bolster its force posture. My take on this is that in Eastern Europe, Russia still does have the time distance advantage. And so that does mean that NATO still has to spend money and invest in defense capabilities, in increasing its readiness and improving military mobility capability. But the Russians are not 10 feet tall, as we say. Militarily, they may not even be 5 feet tall, but that doesn't mean that this is a time that we can rest on our laurels and not prepare for what could happen in the future. Although I don't think Russia wants to start a war with NATO, because that's not something that they would likely win. The second threat is the nuclear piece. And I think throughout the war in Ukraine, of course, we have seen Russia engaging in a lot of nuclear saber rattling about the possibility of using a tactical nuclear weapon, which of course would try to avoid the mutually assured destruction of nuclear war between superpowers, but try to have a more limited nuclear attack that Russia could use in Ukraine for its advantage. Some of us were talking yesterday about whether that is something that Putin might do. And of course, that's anybody's best guess. But kind of our consensus was that's not the most likely path for a couple of reasons. I think one, it wouldn't yield a major battlefield advantage in terms of getting the Ukrainians to surrender or actually, getting more territory or achieving Putin's military objectives. Second, I think it would probably force the West to be more involved than they actually are if we were to see some kind of nuclear threat. And third, I think if that goes sour, it's a huge risk to Putin's grip on power. And obviously his major goal is to stay in power. So I don't know that that would be something he'd want to risk. So of course, this is something that remains a threat to NATO, and we're not quite sure how to deal with it because it challenges a lot of our conceptions about deterrence and about how we deal with nuclear issues. So that's something that's there for the future. And then the last bucket of threats, I think, is the below threshold threats. So, you can call this a bunch of different things, whether it's political warfare or foreign malign influence, active measures, hybrid threats. But these are the things like disinformation, election interference, corruption, the weaponization of energy, economic coercion, the poisonings and assassination attempts that we've seen. That is a toolkit that Russia is very good at using, and I think is likely to turn more to that given its conventional military failures in Ukraine. And this, of course, is an area that's difficult for NATO as a traditional military alliance to respond to. We've kind of been forced into going on the defensive in trying to mitigate the desired impact of these threats by building resilience or resorting to sanctions, which seem to be having some desired effects, but we're still uncovering, what the long-term effects might be and some of the unintended consequences of those in the long term. So I think one big challenge that remains that we haven't quite figured out yet is kind of how to effectively grapple as a collective defense alliance with these below-threshold threats.
Well, it's interesting. I'm hoping that we can get back to the question of whether we've overestimated Russia's conventional strength. We've seen that the failures in Ukraine, the low morale of the troops, the lack of any coherent strategy, all of this, and so that brings us back to the question of France and Germany and their position on this, and whether there's some truth to that. So hopefully we can get back to that. Professor Kimmage, your views on this is the West. Has Vladimir Putin succeeded in bringing the West together?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I feel like just by looking out the window, I'm acquiring a greater global purview as we speak. And thank you for hosting us in such style and such a beautiful setting. So to jump right onto the question that you asked immediately, I think it's clear that Putin has engineered a very profound consolidation of the West in multiple domains. It's not just the NATO alliance, which is poised, I think, to grow this summer, but a much greater sense of self-confidence and internal unity. Even if you would compare it to 6 months ago, or especially 6 to 8 months ago, with the pullout from Afghanistan, that's been a very dramatic shift, I think, within the West. And he's done so not just by, I think, miscalculating on the battlefields of Ukraine. He's done so by demonstrating, and it's nice to get this demonstration now and again, demonstrating not just the dangers of authoritarianism, but the follies of authoritarianism. That authoritarian governments have a tendency to make big mistakes when they make mistakes, and they have a very, very hard time recovering from them. I think the myth of Putin up until the war that began in February was Putin the strategist, Putin the man of discipline, sort of linear, vertical of power in Russia, and that is something that was effective for his foreign policy. You can make the case that it was, in some respects, effective. Well, that's a much harder case to make right now, and that has a lot to do with authoritarianism. And then if you sort of hold up a mirror to the Western alliance or the transatlantic alliance, you see many of the virtues of that alliance, and that's part of the good news. Second point I would make in terms of good news, and of course I'll conclude with the bad news, which is my most extensive point. But let's start with the good news. Is I think I wouldn't want to maybe endorse everything that the French government just said on this point, but the conventional military threat to NATO in and of itself, to the members of the NATO alliance, is I think smaller than it was a few months ago. And it's not because Russia has become more benign toward NATO. To the contrary, it's just that their capacity is less. And a little bit of what Putin has done to himself in this war is to deprive himself of some of the mystique that he had before the war. And he's also deprived his military of some of the mystique it had before the war. And that's a very objective way to weaken yourself on the international stage. And it doesn't mean by any means that all of NATO's problems are solved, but I think it's a bit more secure than it was a couple of months ago. Obviously, if you're sitting in Ukraine, that might seem like very, very cold comfort, but it's a point that matters to members of the NATO alliance. But let me now delve into the bad news, not for the sake of reveling in bad news, but because I think we really want to look into the title of the panel, the challenges that we face. And I want to sort of speak for a moment here as a historian, which is sort of my primary vocation, and just make a few points of comparison between NATO in 1949 and NATO today, and sort of reflect by doing so on some of the storm clouds that I see on the horizon. NATO is created in 1949 with a fairly small number of member states. Then it was legitimately North Atlantic. Now it's something much, much larger, of course. And NATO was hemmed in ways that were useful for the alliance by the Iron Curtain. So the famous phrase of Winston Churchill, from Stettin to Trieste, from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic Sea, that was basically the line. It was quite coherent. There was tension and insecurity. West Berlin was a constant provocation in the early years of the NATO alliance because it fell outside the border. But for the most part, it was a clear, straight, and uncontested line between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Now the situation is totally different in ways that the alliance is really going to have to think through. And I'm going to just premise my remarks on the assumption that Finland and Sweden will join the alliance this summer, which I think is a pretty safe bet. So what you see then is a line that runs not from Stettin to Trieste, but from the northern part of Sweden, all around the bottom of the Black Sea, around Turkey. That's a massive, massive line. Again, it matters that Russia can't really, I think, mount a conventional threat to that, but still it's significant to think about how big that line is. But I think in some ways the news gets even more ominous when you think of that change, when you think about where Ukraine is going to fit in with all of this. I think at the end of the conflict, when it comes, I would love to see Ukraine just triumph over Russia and restore its sovereignty and independence fully, but it's hard for me to imagine that coming to bear 100%. So I think that this line between Russia and NATO, or Russia and the West, is going to run through Ukraine, and it's going to be fluid, and it's going to be uncertain, and it's going to be contested, as Angela said. If Russia sort of loses in the short term, it could come back in the immediate term and reignite the conflict. And the challenge here, I think, and we see it already for NATO, is that NATO is a defensive military alliance. It's structured and designed as it was in 1949 to defend its member states. It's brilliant at doing that, and I think it will remain brilliant at doing that. NATO struggles a lot more when it has to deal with instability in Libya, or instability in Afghanistan, or instability elsewhere. I think its mandate is less clear. And so NATO has been very effective in helping Ukraine. It's helped to train soldiers. It is a factor in the conflict, but it's hard to determine what its role is in those areas that are not, in territory that's not part of the alliance itself. And so I see that as a significant problem going forward. Very final point I'll make about the challenge that Russia will pose, looking at the world through the Kremlin's eyes at the moment, and assuming Putin is not deathly ill and that he'll stay in power. I think Putin's weapon against NATO is by no means conventional military force. I don't think it's even cyber. I just think he waits and tries to exploit any kind of internal instability. if an election goes awry. If two NATO member states, imagine Finland and Turkey disagree about the question of what to do about the Kurds, and Turkey makes that a real, sort of headache or nightmare. That's something that Russia will try to exploit. If tensions emerge between the United States and Canada on the one hand and the countries of Europe on the other, if there are transatlantic sources of division, that's what Putin is going to try to jump on. I don't think that he can create it. I think he's really undermined his own political influence in NATO member states by the war. You just have to walk around Ottawa or Washington or London or Berlin and Paris and see all the Ukrainian flags. You can kind of get a sense of what Putin has done to his own country's reputation in the midst of this war. But still, that instability could happen, and I think he'll jump on it. So I think we really need to factor that in when you speak about coming up with a new set of strategic doctrines for NATO. That has to be a big part of it, how to sort of manage and contain that and not let it get out of control, because I think it's our greatest vulnerability. So I'll conclude on that point.
Well, thank you, Professor Kimmich, for that. Vladimir Putin certainly has become an expert in exploiting those divisions and the polarization that's happening within our own societies as well as internationally. So it's something that we definitely need to be keeping an eye on. Heather, you're an expert, one of Canada's foremost experts on the Arctic. These are issues that Vladimir Putin has also tried to exploit, Indigenous affairs and energy issues. What's your view on these threats?
Yeah, well, first, wonderful to be here. I became a senior fellow at MLI during COVID, so this is actually my first time meeting all my colleagues and first time in Ottawa in 3 years. I actually live outside of Calgary. So just to set some of the context on the Arctic, it was 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev, from Murmansk kind of famously said, this should be a zone of peace. And the Arctic 8 countries have actually worked very hard and quite productively in the last 30 years to achieve that. And that is now a loss. That's kind of been thrown out. Those 3 decades of good faith cooperative efforts are out the window. And so now we need to look at what does that look like for the next 10 or 20 years. Now that we have an Arctic 7 plus Russia. And even this week, I think our Minister of Defense hosted an Arctic Security and Defense Dialogue with the Arctic 7. So that will change the nature and the character of Arctic cooperation going forward for sure. NATO was never explicitly involved in the Arctic per se. There was no NATO Arctic strategy, primarily because Canada didn't want to see that. And I think part of the rationale behind that was there wasn't a great potential for hot conflict in the Arctic, and it might be more provocative, not, in the long run, not as good to have NATO involved in the Arctic explicitly because it would provoke Russia. And that will probably change, especially with Finland and Sweden joining it in the years ahead also. There still isn't, if I look at what are the primary challenges, I don't, no serious person, I think, expects war in the Arctic per se. Not in the same way as you would see in Central Europe or Eastern Europe. And a big part of that is just the military theater, the logistical aspects of it. It's not a place for conventional warfare. It's not a place that you can invade and occupy something. And it's kind of the joke in the Canadian military is if someone came to invade the Canadian Arctic, the first thing we would do is rescue them. So there can be no taking over Ellesmere Island. It's just not feasible, and especially now that it's been exposed, the weakness of the Russian military can't be done. But Arctic cooperation was very important in my mind because it did provide a very constructive outlet for confidence building. We had the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, we had the Polar Code with the International Maritime Organization. There were Arctic Chiefs of Staff meetings before Crimea. And a lot of that has been lost. And what that had achieved, I think, was to grant moderates within Russia, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs within Russia, with some way to point and say, see, international rules-based order is good. It does work. There is legitimacy. There is value in that. And now that has been lost in terms of our relations with Russia also. So what are the hot spots coming up? Obviously with Finland and Sweden coming into NATO, and I agree it's very likely that will probably shift NATO eyes northwards at any rate. Whether we call it Arctic or High North or northern regions, there will be more emphasis, I think, on that region and on the Baltic region, and then of course we have to prepare for that. The other reason why the Arctic has been strategic, and we often think, the Arctic won't see a war, but we might see spillover there, is because the Northern Fleet is in the Kola Peninsula, which is where Russia's nuclear submarines are located, which is part of their nuclear deterrence, essential for nuclear deterrence. That's how they get access to the North Atlantic. And so the biggest exercises you have seen in NATO have been in northern Norway, but you know, we might consider the Arctic, and Finland and Sweden have been participating in those. So it should be fairly seamless from a logistical perspective for them to come into NATO. So the nature of Arctic cooperation has completely changed. The fact is NATO will be drawn northwards with Finland and Sweden there, and that's the next 10 years is going to be a very different security landscape, I would say, for the Arctic than it has been the last 30.
Right, just a quick follow-up. In Russia's 2035 Arctic strategy, they did warn of a potential conflict in the Arctic. It's not the U.S., it's not the Canada, it's not Norway, it's not Sweden that's threatening this, but it's the Russians that are talking about a conflict. Should we be concerned with this rapid militarization that's happened in the Arctic, the fact that the Russians have laid claim to all the resources underneath the Arctic Sea? Is that not concerned? Should we not be concerned about that?
This is why I'm not concerned about it, and I do come maybe on the dovish side of this. We all have too much Arctic. We don't need Russia's Arctic, and Russia doesn't need our Arctic. The problem with resources is not that there's scarcity and we're running out of them. The problem is they're not economic to extract. And so Russia, to set the stage of Russia, they're 50% of the Arctic, 2/3 of the population, and 80% of the regional GDP. They are leaps and bounds bigger than Canadian Arctic GDP in the region. And so have a very defensive posture. When you think of the Northern Sea route and the Arctic and the LNG there, don't compare it to Canada. That's 15 to 20% of their GDP is right there. Our Canadian Arctic and Alaska to less than 1%. Greenland, less than 1%. Their Arctic is much more similar, in my mind, to the Gulf of Mexico. And so if you think that the Russian Arctic is over-militarized, you also think that the American Gulf of Mexico is over-militarized, but that's how important it is to their GDP. And so to make a long story short, it's not easy to steal resources. It's not easy to go and take, especially underwater. The last place on the earth that you could control is the Arctic Ocean underneath the ice cap. So that's why I'm worried about Russia, but logistically, what we're talking about in the Arctic, what we think of in conventional war, occupying Ukraine, all of that is almost impossible in the Arctic.
Right, I guess planting a flag underneath the North Pole is quite different than drilling into the seafloor. Anybody else have a point on? No. So we've talked about quite a bit about Ukraine and the threats in Europe. Is there something that we're missing? Is there something that's happening under the surface that we're not paying attention to? Mr. Oliphant, of course, mentioned Africa. Russia has been extremely active in Africa over the past 10 years. They have expanded their influence in DRC, in Mozambique, and in many other countries, and they're actively trying to expand that influence. We just, we know that Wagner is very active in Mali right now. In your view, what should we be looking at that we're not looking at right now? And we'll start with you, Dr. Sant.
So the subtitle of my book, Putin's World, is Russia Against the West and With the Rest. And so one thing that we're seeing emerging now is that the rest, if you want to call it the global South, takes a very different view of Russia's war with Ukraine. I mean, Putin has assiduously, for the last decade at least, been cultivating ties with the Middle East, particularly since Russia's entry into the Syrian civil war in 2015. More recently with Africa, holding a summit with African leaders in 2019, the first one since the Soviet Union collapsed, and in Latin America as well. And of course, cultivating the relationship with China, which again, I know is going to be discussed in the next panel. And as a result of that, if you look at the UN votes, right, there were 3 votes, 2 condemning Russia's invasion and 1 suspending it from the Human Rights Council, the population of the states that either abstained on these votes or voted with Russia is more than half the world's population. So the leading country is China. Again, China has backed Russia up, even though, as I'm sure we'll hear again later on, it's not comfortable about some of the, the way the war is going. But if you read Chinese publications, you listen to officials, they repeat all of the Russian accusations about NATO threatening Russia. So China being a major country. India, and this was maybe a surprise to some of the Western countries. India being a partner of the United States in the Quad, together with Australia and Japan, again, not condemning Russia, not sanctioning Russia. India buys most of its arms from Russia, its weapons has for decades, and even increasing its imports of Russian oil. All of the BRICS countries, South Africa, another democracy, not condemning Russia, not sanctioning Russia. And if you look, I mean, you mentioned Africa. For a lot of African countries, they still associate Russia with the Soviet Union as the country that was supporting them in their struggles against imperialism. This is particularly true of South Africa and the support that the Soviet Union gave to the African National Congress. And for a number of African countries, the presence of Wagner, the Russian mercenary group, in supporting different leaders there is very important. In the Middle East, major allies of the United States, at least Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, have all, again, not condemned Russia, are not sanctioning Russia. Israel is being very careful. It's criticized Russia, but it depends on its deconfliction agreement with Russia to be able to hit Iranian targets in Syria. And then if you go to Latin America, it's not just Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua who haven't condemned Russia, but Mexico, which should have been really in solidarity with the United States and Canada, has not only, again, not condemned Russia or sanctioned it, but the leading ruling party, Morena, formed a Mexico-Russia caucus in the parliament after the war began. And I think the net result of that really is that when and if the war is over, we will be emerging into a world where you have the richer part of the world, the West, and the one with the most geopolitical clout, having condemned Russia and wanting to contain Russia, but the rest of these countries not being, not criticizing Russia and not being willing clearly to sanction it. And so we'll be in a world where it won't be like the first Cold War, where many countries had to choose sides, although there was still, of course, a non-aligned movement. But a large number of these countries in what we can only say is now a new form of a Cold War will not choose sides and will be quite happy to do business with Russia. And so I think when President Biden said at the beginning of this conflict that Putin will be an international pariah when this war is over. Well, he may be a pariah for the United States, for Canada, for Europe, and for the Asian allies, but not for the rest of the world.
Well, thanks for that. And I do agree. I mean, Vladimir Putin has successfully positioned this war as a conflict, not just between Russia and Ukraine, but as a conflict between the East and the West. And Ukraine is just a pawn in there. And the Southern world has certainly bought that propaganda. Your views, Lauren?
Sure. So I would actually maybe like to shine a light on some of the lessons that we're not talking about enough from the war in Ukraine with respect to emerging tech and the future of warfare and kind of what that might look like. One point I think is that the types of capabilities that we're seeing that are actually quite useful for a small and medium-sized country against a force like Russia have actually been things that are smaller, lighter, more mobile, and more flexible. So things like Javelin, Stingers, short and medium range artillery and air defense systems that are flexible. They don't break the budget. They don't require a ton of training, and regional allies and partners can operate quite effectively. And so I think we might start to see that a kind of shift towards, smaller countries procuring and adopting those kinds of capabilities, as opposed to investing in these massive, mammoth, complex, expensive systems that you can only have a few of and require a ton of maintenance. Not that every country should do that, but that there's some lessons there about what smaller countries can bring to a broader collective fight and use effectively. And so that should factor into NATO's upcoming defense planning process and the capability targets that will come as part of the next summit. The second point I think is about innovation. It's been so interesting to watch Ukrainian forces kind of experiment, not just with new technologies, but also combining different weapon systems in the way that they're using things. So for example, there's been a lot of talk about how they've started to attach basically RPG tips to commercial drones and use those to take out vehicles. Or, we're learning a lot about just the way that, unmanned aerial vehicles can be used in combat, because we're still kind of experimenting as a whole with what that looks like. The Ukrainians are sort of fighting a naval battle around Snake Island without really having a navy. So some interesting things that they're trying around there. For instance, blowing up a Russian helicopter mid-air from launching a missile from, I think it was a TB2 drone. Like, that's a platform that wasn't necessarily designed for that use initially. So they're trying new things, which are kind of interesting to watch what that will mean for future warfare and what lessons that NATO and other militaries can learn from that. And then lastly, I think, so NATO is doing a lot on emerging tech to try and make sure that we're capturing these types of capabilities and we can leverage them more as part of our strategic edge over Russia and China. Some of the things that we'll hear a lot about, I suspect, at the next summit are this new Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, Diana, as it's been dubbed inside NATO, as well as the NATO Innovation Fund. And they're geared exactly towards these types of things, trying to figure out how we can invest in drones and new capabilities, new tech. But I think it's so important for us to connect the dots between what we're seeing in real life on the ground in Ukraine and those kinds of new initiatives. I really worry about us falling prey to kind of shiny object syndrome and investing in technology for technology's sake. And I think it'd be more effective if we pick a few specific cases, for instance, based on what we've seen on the ground in Ukraine, and say, what do we want to do with this technology? And kind of invest, develop, adopt, procure, based on those couple of cases that we can agree on as an alliance. That will help us channel our resources and our budgets more effectively. And I think, it just underscores the notion that, this isn't, I think where NATO's value add on tech is not about, imagining lasers on the moon in 50 years. It's about, what technology is required for us to win the battle that's playing out today and tomorrow. So making sure that we keep those efforts realistic and focused on what we're seeing today.
Yeah, I read an interesting story on the way to Ottawa on the train yesterday about these Ukrainian soldiers who are riding around with javelins on electric bikes. And the electric bikes, they don't make any sort of sound. So they're able to sneak up on these Russian tank columns and get away quite quickly undetected because of those electric bikes. So quite interesting. Michael, what are we not looking at right now? What do we need to start looking at?
Sure. So 2 points. I'll make one about domestic Russian politics and then about globalization to pick up the thread that both Angela and Lauren were developing in that regard. I think one has to admit, and of course evidence is very difficult to come by, and Russia has become a black box after the war in many respects in terms of our journalism and understanding of the country. But I think that we do have to admit that the war is relatively popular in Russia. And yes, that's media manipulation and Kremlin propaganda. That's in a way obvious, but it's deeper than that. And I think we need to reckon freely for strategic purposes with the pitch of anti-Western sentiment within Russia. It's not purely concocted and created. It does resonate. Many of the most critical people who have economic means have left the country, but within the country, I don't think Putin's popularity has gone through the floor. And I think the war is looked upon as something that is or sort of has to be in Russia's interests. Granted, I don't feel like I have perfect evidence on this. That's just my inference from what I see. But that's the best I can do in terms of my observation. That's unpalatable to us. It doesn't fit our narratives of what we would like perhaps to believe about Russia, or perhaps it does in some respects, but those narratives then are pretty bleak. But that would suggest to me, if it's true, and I know it's very debatable, that even if Putin were to fall, or if he is gravely ill, a lot of the infrastructure, political infrastructure within the country that made the war possible is not going to disappear when Putin exits the stage. So I'll just make that as a hypothesis and sort of put it before us. But it really does matter to NATO whether this war is the whim of Vladimir Putin or whether it speaks to something larger within the strategic culture of Russian elites and within the political culture of the country at large. Second point about globalization, just want to highlight here a contradiction. I think Russia made a bet against the West, or whatever we might want to call it, transatlantic alliance, sort of allies and partners in the coalition that's sanctioning Russia and supporting Ukraine. They made a bet that the world is multipolar. That's what the Russians have been saying since the 1990s, and that the West controls less than it thinks it does. Russia has a greater, sort of sense of latitude. It can accomplish more. It can work with the Chinese and other partners, and it will get through the many crises that it sees on the horizon with the West capably. I think that that's very much up for grabs, but it's a part of the Russian calculus, and it's not been completely disproven by the war in all the ways that Angela outlined when you look at Mexico, when you look at the Middle East, India, and China. But I think it is a contradiction in the following way, and again, thinking a little bit historically, the Soviet Union had something to offer, not just an ideology, but it had modernization to offer. That was the country that modernized itself in the 1930s from a position of great backwardness, and it beat Nazi Germany. At least that was the storyline that was put forward to the world, and that made the Soviet Union genuinely very popular in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. It had a recipe for modernization. Putin's Russia has nothing of the sort. It really has very little to offer, and here I would say Putin's sort of crazed civilizational grounding for the war is really a debit for Russian foreign policy at large. It looks like a very parochial, inward, incompetent, sort of nationalistic or imperialistic power. And I think that that really curtails what it can accomplish in a world that probably is, in many ways, multipolar. So it's acknowledged an important fact about the world that we live in, that there are these different bases of power. But I think the war has shown, in a way, how incapable Russia is of competing within a multipolar world. And it's interesting when you use the formulations, Angela, like these countries haven't criticized. It's very interesting, and I think it's true, but it's different not to criticize. What's different from not criticizing is to admire and to affirm and to approve and to say, wow, great job, you guys are really going down the right path. And I think there, even China, as you indicate, Angela, is convinced that Russia is not going down the right path. So not criticizing is a big category at the moment. Approving of what Russia does, I think that that's no country outside of Russia, including Belarus, really approves of what Russia is doing, and that's a huge long-term debit.
Well, thank you for that. If we look at Russia domestically, I often wonder whether we could do a bit more work, look to our Baltic allies, and do a bit more work on supporting civil society in Russia, Russian civil society, the pro-democracy movement, and independent media there, to try and inject some truth into Russia and give Russians that ability to receive news and facts over what the Kremlin is feeding them. Heather, what are we, from your perspective, your Arctic perspective, what are we not looking at? What do we need to look at more closely?
Well, everyone at MLI knows that I need to talk about energy security and commodities in every single conversation I have. and it is terrifying to me to think about what the next 5 years are going to look like for mining, for oil, for gas, for food, for fertilizer. And it was already terrifying, and taking Russia out of the equation is pouring gasoline on the fire. So we weren't producing enough oil in the last 5 years to meet demand. Global inventories of oil have never gone down faster as they have in the last year and a half. And they're still going down. We haven't reached an equilibrium where they started to balance out yet. And now we're taking Russia out of the equation. And I don't know what's worse, letting Russia keep selling oil and gas and enriched uranium so they can have money, or taking it off the market and everyone else paying twice as much for energy than what we were paying 5 years ago. So this is, the Parliamentary Secretary Oliphant mentioned the food crisis. Taking out Russia's wheat, taking out Russia's fertilizer is going to cause pain for all of us. The high cost of diesel and fertilizer aren't even built into our food prices today, because that's coming in this year's growing season. So if you think food inflation is bad now, wait till the cost of fertilizer and diesel are added to that cost for next year. So there's nothing we can do in the short term to alleviate this. It takes a long time to ramp up oil and gas production and redistribute foods, all these supplies. And there wasn't excess capacity to begin with, because that's not how globalization works. So the next 5 years are going to be painful, and we're lucky to be in Canada, where we have all these things, but a lot of people are not lucky. And so Russia's the second biggest it's not just oil and gas, but oil and gas is obviously huge, but it's also the second biggest miner in the world. And it's also the one that enriches, even though Canada has tons of uranium, Russia is the one that enriches it. And now we're seeing new nuclear reactors getting announced and coming along. I think that's fantastic. But if you need enriched uranium, where are you going to get it from? So this disruption to global supply chains is I'm going to say it, I think in the next 5 years, that will be the biggest security threat. People protest and have coups and bring down governments because they cannot afford energy and because they cannot afford food. And that's already starting to happen. And there's no way this won't happen more in the next 5 years, I guess.
Well, and that brings us to our next question, which is what is to be done given all of these challenges? My concern, based on what you're saying, is that does the Western world in the next 6 to 12 months return to business as usual as we did after 2014? Is that inflation going to be too much to bear? Are we going to remove those sanctions on Russia and allow Vladimir Putin to continue operating as if nothing happened? Is that a possibility?
So the concern is the West is principled and can afford to not accept Russia oil and gas and wheat and fertilizer, but Asia can't afford that and Africa can't afford that. And there'll be some price where India and Nigeria are going to buy Russian goods because people will die if they don't. So that is the concern, I think, is that we will be pushing Russia to Asia and strengthening their bond, and again, making it more multipolar. And I don't, where it's a rock and a hard place.
I mean, I think it's going to be very increasingly difficult to keep Western unity together. I mean, just last week you had the head of Volkswagen gave an interview to the Financial Times and said, the impact of these sanctions is already being felt very badly in Europe. It's going to get much worse, and we have to come to our senses. We have to persuade the Ukrainians that it's time to settle with the Russians, and we have to start lifting the sanctions. And he's not a lone voice. So I think and I'm just talking now about the Western countries, the impact of inflation, of higher gasoline prices, all the things we've heard about. I think that there'll be growing pressure to re-examine some of the sanctions, and also to question what appears to be the U.S. government's view now, which is the Ukrainians can actually win, and so we're going to continue supplying them with the weapons that might enable them to push Russia back. So I think that's going to be a real problem going forward, and I think there will be voices that will say we have to get back to doing business with Russia, literally business, or in terms of the kind of, if you look at the U.S.-Russian part of it, the strategic relationship, the nuclear weapons question, that there will be some pressure there to at least enter into a dialogue. We have the New START treaty expiring in 2026. So I think it won't be like after 2014, but I find it very hard to imagine that there'll be this continuing total severance of contacts.
Well, having read some of Garry Kasparov's tweets and certainly Navalny and Vladimir Kara-Murza, they've all suggested that we need to keep sustain those sanctions on Russia until the day that Vladimir Putin leaves. But you don't think that do you think that the Western world has the courage to do that? Has the
I think it's going to be, I mean, I know obviously I understand their views and where they're coming. I think it's going to be, I would be skeptical that Western unity would hold.
Lauren, what are your views? Where do we go from here? How do we address this challenge? Is there any way for us to win?
Yeah, of course. That's the million-dollar question. I think, a lot of the messaging that we're hearing from the U.S. now, about what winning looks like, I think with respect to Ukraine in particular, is that, return to territorial integrity where, every last inch of territory pre-2014, ideally, but also, pre-February 2022, is returned to Ukraine. I don't think we're likely to see that in the short term, of course. So the true test is, of course, how long we can stay united. And to the points about, making sure that there's no cracks that start to emerge, already we're seeing that. And, we have to find a way to keep the Turkeys and the Hungaries of the world on sides and make sure that they stay rooted within the alliance and, don't disrupt that unity. I think on the point about business, one of the things that came up in some of the conversations we were having as a group yesterday was absolutely this link between economics and trade and security and defense. And we kind of saw Europe grappling with this over the last 3-ish years or so, in terms of just take the example of 5G infrastructure and how, the US was trying to call attention to the security vulnerabilities of doing business with authoritarian regimes and, the fact that we can't compromise on those values. And so I think there has been a sea change over those last few years, and now we're in a place where, we see that we can't just have a strictly business energy deal with Russia or a strictly business 5G deal with China, and still have the US as a security guarantor. We have to make these tough choices about short-term economic gain versus long-term security and principles. And that values piece is so crucial. I mean, today, theme of this conference, we are in a fundamental struggle between democracies and autocracies. So Russia and China's authoritarian models and liberal democracy. And the Western-led liberal order, rules-based order, NATO was created to defend that and to defend those values. And so I think this is a time where we cannot afford to compromise on that. And so that has to be core to everything we do. And, that takes bold leadership to make those choices, but also to communicate the importance of those values. And I think we've gotten better at telling that story. And frankly, Putin has helped himself. The case for NATO has never been stronger. I mean, the case for this liberal order and our alliance structure, clearly NATO is the only game in town when it comes to security and defense. And I think, people have realized that, but that doesn't mean that we can stop communicating that to our publics and making that message heard, because that's ultimately public opinion side will enable our leaders to keep this unity long term. The other thing I would say, and we were talking about this a bit yesterday too, is the need to stay focused on long-term strategy, because I think we have a habit, understandably, of jumping from fire to fire and kind of having knee-jerk reactions to world events because of limited bandwidth and finite resources and all of that. But I think this has been a wake-up call that we can't afford to do that we need to think strategically about both our relationships with Russia and China, what happens after with both of their leaders long term, how we're going to balance the two of those. I think it has been a wake-up call as well about the need to think about key contested regions like the Black Sea region, and not just thinking about Ukraine in a vacuum, but also the connections to the Caucasus and the Eastern Mediterranean, and how all these regions fit together and how that fits with Russia's strategic objectives. And we haven't done a good enough job thinking about those regions on the fringes. And then finally, I think it also calls into attention, and this gets back to your question about, is Russia still a conventional military threat? I think this just shows that we can't just build up our defenses overnight. If we suddenly decide that, Russia does something and we now need to be prepared, all of that takes years of investing and preparing in advance. We can't just have readiness or have military mobility or have pre-positioned stocks where we need them in Europe overnight. And you can't have interoperability where a bunch of allies, 30 different countries can come together and all of a sudden successfully fight a war together. You have to be training that in preparation. And also, to the point about supply chains and production, you also can't build a bunch of weapon systems overnight. We need to actually be thinking about what our needs will be several years in the future. And so I think that just calls into attention that we have to seize this moment now to better prepare for the future.
Right, and just on the sanctions and energy, I think Canada actually has a role to play here. We have lots of liquefied natural gas, or we have natural gas which we can liquefy. If we can get it to Europe, I think that we can help Europe wean off their reliance on Russian gas and certainly help in that regard as well. Michael, what do we need to do to remain united and challenge this rising authoritarianism?
Okay, so 3 points also to what you were asking about before. First, there's going to be no going back. I wouldn't even worry about that for a moment. This is not 2014 at all. This is a profound rupture between Russia and the West, and it goes in both directions. I mean, it's really initiated by Putin's decision to go to war, but Putin is taking Russia away from the West in a way that hasn't been seen since the times of Peter the Great. He is going to deintegrate Russia, or he'll try to, and in a way that's his sovereign choice, and we'll sort of see where that takes the country. And I think on our side, there's no will, nor could there be, to work with Putin in some cooperative way or to return to discussions about reintegrating Russia into, the OSCE will still be there, but, sort of Russia-NATO councils and that kind of stuff, that's just all of the past. And there's no way that that can be repaired unless there would be transformative change in Russian leadership, and that would be nice to contemplate, but it's just not something that we can base policy on at the present moment because it's not a likely probability. So I think that the rupture of February 2022 is really serious, and I suspect will be with us for decades. Sort of a neutral point, whether that's good or bad. It's going to be just necessary, I think. Secondly, I think the word win is probably the wrong word to use in this situation. I don't think that you win against nuclear powers. I mean, certainly that's the consistent lesson of the Cold War, that you can't defeat a nuclear power. Russia could be defeated in Ukraine, but as such, it can't be defeated unless it would sort of collapse internally. That doesn't really make sense, I think, for us as a policy aim. And I think that we'll just end up with a lot of frustration if we put winning as our primary goal. So that would sort of take me to my third point, that we'll probably need an updated form of containment, which was not a strategy. I mean, it's true, Kennan in the late 40s did sort of imagine that the Soviet Union would fall apart due to its internal contradictions. So there was some sense of a kind of long-term victory perhaps on the Western side. But really what Kennan had in mind is, how do you honor your most important values and principles? How do you form the most meaningful partnerships, of which NATO was the crucial one in the late 1940s? And how do you manage conflicts with a power that you can't defeat in the way that the United States defeated Germany and Japan in the Second World War? So you're not going to get unconditional surrender. What are your most important principles? And that's really going to have to be worked out in Ukraine. I myself don't have a clear image of what's possible. Is it sovereignty and independence for the full country? Is it some compromised version of that? Is it going to be a little bit less? I think that will be a work in progress. And the final point I'd make in terms of containment, simply to gesture toward the panel that's going to come after our panel, is that we need to have this conversation simultaneously about Europe, but also about Asia, because resources are finite, attention is finite. You do have to sort of work these priorities out together. So we wouldn't want maximalist ambitions in Europe to get in the way of our Asia policy. We'll have to find a way of sort of integrating and balancing all of these things. But again, I would take winning, I would take the word winning somehow off the table. I hope that we win, but I wouldn't make that the orientation point for the policy.
Absolutely. So winning is the wrong word, but in the context of Ukraine and the conflict there right now, my question would then be, is stopping Vladimir Putin right now enough, or do we need to defeat him? Do we need to defeat him so he's humiliated? What does that win look like? What would we be satisfied with? What could preserve Ukrainian sovereignty, and what's the outcome that we're looking for? I would ask any of you that, what's the outcome? Is it just stopping him, or do we need to defeat him and humiliate him in Ukraine right now?
Well, just two quick points to follow up. I think one way that you could argue at the moment, it's persuasive to me, is that Ukraine has already won. Obviously, it's in the midst of a terrible battle, and Russia will continue wreaking havoc. But Russia's initial intent, of course, it was a kind of lunatic strategy at the beginning, was to achieve political control of Ukraine, and that will never happen. Ukraine's sort of political sovereignty and independence, not territorial, but political sovereignty and independence, has been guaranteed by Zelensky and his government, and by the efforts of civilians and soldiers in Ukraine. So, maybe that sounds unduly optimistic, but I think it's a very significant point. They've already achieved a very major political victory, and I think they're going to build on that in the future. Second point is, when it comes to territory and all of that, I simply don't know. I find it very hard to say, and maybe in the next 6 weeks we'll get a better sense if Russia has truly exhausted itself and can't go forward, or if it mobilizes and chooses to go all out. We'll probably know a little bit more 2 months from now.
I mean, it's very hard to imagine Ukraine being able in the near future to oust Russia from the entire Donbass and from Crimea. So winning might have to, yes, Ukraine as a sovereign state with territorial integrity, but different from what it was probably before February the 24th. And even that, you could say, is a humiliation for Putin, because, that's not what he wanted, the blitzkrieg. They thought they were going to take Ukraine over in 72 hours. But I think we probably have to be realistic. In the longer run, maybe Ukraine does in the end expel Russia from all of these parts of its territory. But that, it would be a good enough win, I would think, going forward.
Lauren?
I would just quickly add, I mean, I actually think it is very important to use the word win, because I think we have to maintain that narrative, you know, in support of Ukraine. And I actually thought it was a very marked shift and an important shift when we started hearing, you know, the US administration change the narrative from what used to be Jake Sullivan talking about, you know, our job is to keep Ukraine in the fight. No, our job is to help Ukraine win, to ensure that Ukraine wins. And then also Secretary Austin taking the step further to say, and, you know, also we want to strangle Russia to the point where it can't do these types of things elsewhere. And of course, he got a lot of blowback for that, and people were all up in arms about that. But I actually think that that is a good thing to talk about. I mean, we don't want Russia to do this elsewhere, and we do want Ukraine to win. And so even if that's not necessarily realistic, I think that's an important part of the narrative, and, you know, underscoring that this is right and wrong. Like, these are very clear principles that we stand for, and that we can't just appease, you know, Russia.
Heather, what do we need to do?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that, but in terms, just to get your original point, which I think relates to this, is how the Russian military has been exposed as much weaker as we thought. And I don't know if everyone's heard this joke, but we used to think Russia was the second most powerful military in the world, and now we see it's the second most powerful in Ukraine. But in terms of the Arctic, I mean, I think that changes the psychology of Arctic security also, where you always thought, oh, Russia is militarizing, they're so much more powerful, they're the most powerful actor there. And now you have to look back and think, well, just how powerful are they? Just what could they do in the Arctic? And it must be less than what we thought they could do 6 months. And so that has implications for where we spend money, how we spend money, what we need to spend money for, and addresses a little bit, I think, of the security dilemma that we have in the Arctic. So there may be other things that we can do with our resources that maybe we didn't think we could do 6 months ago that might just be more efficient, or might be putting it, you know, in areas like the northern region of Europe instead of having to focus, you know, on the Northwest Passage or something like that.
I'll just follow up with that. Is Canada prepared right now when it comes to the Arctic? Are we prepared for these potential challenges that might emerge?
Well, the funny thing is, if you go to any country and their Arctic policy, everyone says, oh, you know, Denmark is so much better, United States is so much better, Canada is so much better, Norway is so much better. Everyone says everyone else is so much better, and that they're the only ones who are underprepared and under-resourced. And so I think sometimes the political rhetoric gets in the way of what the military actually thinks they need, what the military actually thinks are the resources that they could use, and where they would put it. So I think it's a good time to follow the military's lead on what their wish list is, instead of just saying, well, Russia is you know, wild and crazy, and so we just need to dump $20 billion into the Arctic because. So that's where, you know, this is the time where we can look back and say what's actually really strategic, given what we know now more about the Russian military.
I'm going to open up the floor for any questions. Does anybody have any questions right now? Brian, do we have a mic? Great. Oh, we need the volume up on them.
So with apologies to the three American members of the panel, I run a Canadian think tank, and I have a Canadian on the panel, and I want to ask about some Canadian issues. You know, there's been, so Heather, there's been a lot of discussion on this panel about the failures of the West to be prepared militarily for what's happened in Ukraine within the NATO alliance and so on. But I think your remarks also point to the fact that it's not only military preparedness that matters. For example, having oil and gas resources available to the Western Alliance from sources that aren't controlled by our adversaries is a key strategic consideration. And you know, we've been talking a lot about what should the various national governments within NATO do to prepare themselves in future. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the natural resource equation in that strategic context. And let me just mention for everybody else's benefit that I read something you wrote recently, which I thought was terribly important, about how we've completely misunderstood the transition that has to happen away from traditional reliance on fossil fuels. And it's a mistake to think that we can get off fossil fuels, and that the correct answer is to mitigate the dangerous impact of using fossil fuels while still using those fuels. And of course, Canada has the second or third largest reserves of oil in the world, and we've invested $300 or $400 billion in the capacity to extract oil from the oil sands, for example. And yet we have, a government in Ottawa that has spent the last few years arguing that we should leave this stuff in the ground, and that we shouldn't build the infrastructure to get it out, and so on and so on. And I'd like you to tie that together with what's happened in Ukraine.
Bless you for asking me a question about Canadian
And
oil
she
and
didn't
gas.
even tell me to ask.
But as bad as all this is, there's probably no country in the world that stands to benefit from all this more than Canada. And so what does that look like strategically for Canada? And in terms of, if it's inevitable now that there's some kind of bifurcation from Russia, that there's going to be more onshoring, that supply chains need to be more local or regional, even though that it does make it more expensive. It absolutely will make it more expensive, but still for security reasons, we need to have more security in our supply chains. Canada has all those resources and doesn't use them. United States is a huge producer of oil, huge producer of mining, top 3, top 4 for mining also, but it uses all of it, so it's not a great exporter, whereas Canada does export. In fact, American production of oil is basically flat for domestic use. It produces the most, but it uses the most. And when it's exporting right now, what it is exporting oil sands oil that we shipped down to the Gulf of Mexico, and that was using it to export to Europe and to gain that geopolitical leverage. So nothing can be done in a year or 2 or 3, but if I look at 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, if the world has indeed changed, and I think it has, in terms of relying on Russian resources, or even thinking about Chinese resources, or Middle Eastern resources, then yes, Canada has an opportunity, I think, to use its resources, I won't say as a weapon, but as in a strategic way that other countries have been using their resources in a strategic way. And I think, Jason Kenney was in Alberta this week, Minister Wilkinson, was in Washington, D.C. this week, talking about what does a North American energy alliance look like. And that to me is obvious. There's a Battle of Alberta going on right now, but if we don't give you guys oil and gas, it'll be a different kind of Battle of Alberta in 10 years. So there is an opportunity for Canada, I think, to finally use its resources for geopolitical ends, for strategic ends, which hasn't even occurred to anyone. And to Brian's point, I think now it would be madness. 6 months ago, maybe it seemed like a reasonable idea for Canada to stop producing oil and gas. But now the world has changed, and it seems like it would be madness for the largest producer that is a democracy, the largest reserves that is a democracy, to take it off the market and to shut itself in. And I don't think the Americans will accept it. I think in 5 years, when we're in the middle of this crisis, the Americans would not accept us doing that anyway. So we need to focus on reducing our emissions. There are ways to do it. I think it's cheaper to carbon capture than to build completely new energy systems in the world anyways. I think the cheapest, fastest way is to just carbon capture off fossil fuels. And then, we can move to hydrogen and all those things also. So this is an opportunity for Canada. We can make some lemonade out of the lemons, unlike for most countries where it's just a straight up loss.
Anyone else? No? We have two questions in the back. Maybe we'll take those two together. Maybe you can identify yourself before you ask the question as well.
Sure. My name is George Boney. My question is an extreme version of a number of points that have been made. My institutional base and my work is all in Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. There's a perception there that however the battlefield, the war plays out, Putin is in fact winning the economic war with Europe and with the UK. On the Russian side, the Institute of International Finance's, aside from the strength of the ruble, latest assessment is that Russia is on the way to the largest current account surplus in its history, which means all of this hard currency coming in. On the European and UK side, we're looking at, as was mentioned earlier, stagflation driving concerns and fears about a recession. German CEOs, a number of them have made that point. UK, the Bank of England has just issued their report in May, which effectively, if you read a little bit between the lines, reflects the same thing. On the Asian side, there's very much a concern about this. We are cushioned to some extent in North America. There's now increasing debate also about a global recession. And again, going back to Asia, they look with alarm at what happened in Sri Lanka. So I'd be very interested in your comments on that, and also how you would see a way of getting a different message across to Asia. Thank you.
Great, and we'll take the gentleman, Anvesh? Yeah, we'll take two at the same time, I think.
Hello, my name is Anvesh Jain. I'm a law student at the University of Ottawa. And speaking of the Battle of Alberta, just go Calgary tonight, rooting for you. So if this conflict in Russia and Ukraine ends up being a frozen conflict in the Donbass, which I think one of the likeliest scenarios at the moment, what are the implications for Ukrainian accession to NATO and future Western policies moving forward? This can be for anybody in the panel. Do you see it becoming a prolonged proxy contest where we just funnel weapons into the region? And in that scenario, what should the goalposts and policy conditions for a quote-unquote victory become at that point? Thank you.
Okay, so we have two questions. One about economic pressures, the next about Ukraine. Who would like to start out?
I can
Dr.
say
Sen?
something about the Ukraine and
Great.
and NATO part of it. So the accession to NATO. So when the war was in its early stages, President Zelensky indicated that Ukraine would be willing to say that it will be a neutral country. But in exchange for that, obviously, the Russian troops had to withdraw to where they were on February 23rd, and there had to be security guarantees from the West. I mean, initially they said the security guarantees should come from also the P5 countries, China and Russia included. And in fact, there are discussions going on, certainly within US circles about what kind of security guarantees the United States, for instance, would be willing to afford Ukraine, because essentially what it would need would be the equivalent of an Article 5 guarantee, which would be, we're a neutral country, but if we are attacked by someone, you'll come to our assistance. And of course, that issue is very problematic, and that's why in 2008, when the Bush administration tried to get a membership action plan for Ukraine, it was unable to do that. The Germans and the French particularly objected to it, and so the whole thing was sort of put off. So I don't think the possibility of Ukrainian accession to NATO, I think, is very distant now. Although, there are people who argue, I think correctly, if Ukraine had been a member of NATO, this would not have happened. But this was clearly one of the justifications that Putin gave for taking this military action against Ukraine. I think what the Ukrainians are now looking for is European Union, a path to European Union membership. And we had Ursula von der Leyen there. They filled out the forms to become a candidate member. There's going to be a vote, I think, in June. But that also would be a very, very long process. And, President Macron has said that he can't really see that happening, and there should be variable geometry. So I think that probably it's very hard to envisage a path for Ukraine into NATO in the foreseeable future. And I do think that the most likely scenario, as I mentioned before, will be a kind of protracted frozen conflict with Russia still controlling parts of the Donbass. It's taken more territory in the Donbass now, possibly integrating them into the Russian Federation. We hear all these rumors, but that hasn't happened yet. But I think that is a more likely scenario, and that will mean that the United States and all the allies will continue to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia, if you like, but that there won't, there isn't any definitive resolution of this in sight.
Lauren?
I don't have much to add to that. That's a fantastic answer. I mean, I think that it's very difficult to I think Russia has shown, just as it did in Georgia, that the territorial complications of what it has done now in Ukraine prevent membership. And there was a time where I thought maybe we would see this traditional process of countries getting NATO accession before EU accession. Maybe that would be reversed, and we would see them start to become EU members first. But now that seems to also be losing momentum. So I'm not hopeful. And to your point about security guarantees, I mean, that is a good notion, but what does that actually look like? I mean, we have no model for that. So I think that's the challenge.
Michael,
Let me try to address the question about economics. It is, of course, important to bear in mind as Heather emphasized, the many economic costs that are following from this. And we haven't spoken about food security, which is not per se an economic cost, but a huge and rising cost of this conflict. So that all forms part of the global picture. But from what I understand of Western policy, it's not about regime change in Russia, and it's not about imposing punishment on Russia's people through economic means. The core element of the sanctions is really making it difficult for the Russian military to modernize. And in that regard, I would just say that we're at the beginning of the policy. 6 months from now, you see a lot of Russian armaments companies that can't get access to microchips and are taking them from vacuum cleaners and some domestic products and putting them into tanks, and already sort of improvising in ways that are a bit crazy. I think that you really want to use the metric not of what's happened in the last 11 weeks. This is the very early phase of this conflict, but see where things are in a month in terms of Russia's military modernization. Clearly, the country is still amassing hard currency. That's a significant circumstance. But I think the military, or rather the military-industrial complex in Russia, faces huge, huge challenges. And I don't think that the Chinese can backfill sufficiently for Russia. So I think the military is going to start to fall behind. We've spoken about corruption and inefficiency, sort of strategic problems of the Russian military, but its very ability to modernize is going to be more difficult, and that's essential to the policy. In a sense, going back to this notion of making it more difficult for Russia to wage these kinds of wars in the future, I think that that's the most important piece of the puzzle. And I wouldn't presume total success in terms of sanctions in this regard, but I would assume significant success, but will come with all kinds of secondary costs, certainly, for Western consumers and for the members of all of our countries, but especially, as you point out, for the European ones. For what it's worth, this is only anecdotal, but I was at an event in D.C. last week where both Jake Sullivan and Colin Kahl, the sort of number 2 at the Pentagon, spoke, and they predicted a long conflict that will end in a negotiated settlement. So there, the sort of ambiguity of Ukraine winning comes into full focus when you get statements like that, because that's sort of where we were toward the beginning of the conflict, and that seems to be their thinking at the moment. I think the administration, if you look at Secretary Austin's comments, they go in a different direction. They can't make up their mind on this point. But if it ends up a frozen conflict, that's of course a very bad outcome for Ukraine in a lot of ways, especially economically. If the naval blockade remains, it's an exporting country, it needs access to the Black Sea, and a frozen conflict would put that in peril. But on the other hand, looking at things more optimistically, I almost think that the debate about NATO for Ukraine by now is irrelevant. Look at the nature of the military support that they're getting. I mean, I heard that Norway supplied Ukraine with its entire artillery. The U.S. is funneling in more and more sophisticated weapons, is going to keep on doing that. It's almost better than being a NATO member. You're sort of, it's a kind of rapid fire military modernization that's really showing results on the battlefield for Ukraine. So even if it lands in a frozen conflict, which is a very far from ideal outcome, it's going to be a mini superpower in Central Europe, and it's going to have maybe a level of sophistication. Here's where the sanctions policy on Russia also plays a role. It's going to have a level of sophistication in terms of its armaments that Russia may not have, which could have really significant long-term implications. And then maybe one can start to speak about winning more on Ukrainian terms. So I think Ukraine has made huge military strides. And I think we get tangled up with all of this NATO conversations. To me, it's the less interesting part of the story. The more interesting part of the story is the full-throated commitment it's getting.
Well, sir, and I would add to that Canada has really played a large role in creating that sophisticated Ukrainian army by sending in trainers in 2015 already. The Ukrainian army before that in 2014, the army versus the army today, it's quite different. That's largely thanks to the Canadian trainers that were sent there to train the modern Ukrainian army.
It's an 8-year story, absolutely. It's not a 12-week story. It's an 8-year story.
That's right. It's an 8-year story. Heather, do you have?
Yeah, I'll just add to the economic question, and I agree it's concerning when you see that, Russia's raking in the rubles and people are paying in the rubles. But I think the force of the sanctions have not been felt yet. And so they're having some short-term game, but in producing, it's not easy to produce 10 million barrels of oil in a day. And they can't keep, and they won't keep doing that. And part of it is they're losing Western investment, but they're losing Western know-how. And the easy oil and the easy gas is out, and we're getting into areas, where you have to go, into the Arctic, and it's the harder stuff to get is what's left. And now they don't have access to the expertise, but they also don't have access to the parts. And you could be missing a $2,000 part, and that means that your $100,000 barrel a day operation is out of commission. So once parts start breaking and they can't get replacement parts, and even developing, for example, the Arctic LNG project, which is in development, isn't producing yet. Well, that will probably be delayed for years. Because they can't get, the things that they need to liquefy it that they thought that they were going to get before. So the sanctions haven't had their impact on production yet, and this will trickle into mining, any parts you need for industrial activity. They're going to have Soviet-level capacity, for a lot of these things, and not able to rely on German manufacturing, for example. So this will start to hurt their production in everything, and it just hasn't taken place yet. But this is bad for the West, but it's going to be far, far worse for Russia. It was a terrible strategic part, terrible loss on Russia's part economically.
Right, and it has inhibited their ability to produce new weapons. And as Michael was mentioning earlier, that there was a report this week that appliance parts are right now being used to repair damaged Russian weapons. So it's hurting right now. Those sanctions are painful. There was another question here, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion of various scenarios going forward. I'd just like to ask sort of a general question. What assurances do we have in following the various scenarios you've talked about that we won't get into some sort of direct conflict with Russia, stumble in even into a World War III type situation, as we did with Germany twice in the 20th century, over failed alliances, security guarantees that can't be backed up, or prolonged conflicts that are not settled. Because if anyone watched the Monk debate between Mearsheimer and Walt and the others, you might have noticed that the question was whether Russian security interests should be taken into account in coming to some kind of final settlement. And although the opinion was in favor of that, the debate, the fairly hardline debate, in which we heard many of the scenarios we've heard today, only narrowed that. So in coming to a conclusion to this, it seems that we have to take into context the Russian security interests. That may mean some sort of territorial compromise. But Mearsheimer made the point that the longer the conflict goes on, the more that Ukraine loses and the greater the chances for coming into direct conflict. So what assurances do we have that this will not happen?
So, and I'll add to that question about taking into account Russian security concerns. There's a question from Mark that was sent in before our event via email. Mark asks, Russia will still exist after this conflict is over. How can the West restart some form of cooperation or peaceful coexistence with the country after the war? What are the conditions for this? And I would ask, do we need to do this with Vladimir Putin? So does anyone want to start with this? Dr. Stan?
Well, we have no assurances that we won't get into a direct conflict with Russia, because it's going to depend largely on what Russia does. I mean, certainly the President Biden made it clear from the beginning that there will be no U.S. troops in Ukraine. This is why there's the Ukrainians are not getting a no-fly zone, because then you might have the possibility of U.S. or NATO pilots, whatever, coming into direct contact with the Russians. So I think from the point of view of NATO, restraint is being applied. I think there's some NATO countries in the East, the frontline states, who maybe would like to see less restraint, but you know, NATO is being very restrained. So I think the NATO side is doing everything it can not to come into a direct conflict with Russia. But we don't know what the Russians are going to do. I mean, if Putin were to decide to deploy a tactical nuclear weapon, I mean, he's sort of threatened to do so, then, you know, and the West has certainly said that if that happens, there will be an appropriate and robust response to that. Obviously, they're not saying what it would be. Then I think the danger of some kind of a direct conflict is possibly there. I mean, the problem with people like Mearsheimer and their arguments are, what are Russia's security concerns? Russia is a nuclear superpower. Its neighbors are much weaker than it is. Ukraine, you know, wasn't thinking of attacking Russia. None of its neighbors is thinking of attacking Russia. The US isn't interested, you know, in attacking Russia. So all of these Russian complaints about indivisible security and how insecure Russia feels, objectively, you look at it, and there's absolutely no reason why you should believe that. Now, you can say there's a self-perception, and it's been there for hundreds of years, that Russia's vulnerable because it doesn't have natural borders except in the north. And so this is part of the Russian narrative, but it's belied by reality. So, you know, if this conflict comes to an end, what kind of security guarantees or are we supposed to give Russia? I mean, it's, you know, it invaded a country through absolutely no provocation. So I find this kind of argument, we've been grappling with this at least since the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, that Russia has complained after the Soviet collapse that it's vulnerable and that we don't take its security interests seriously. No. So what are the problems there? Well, you know, the narrative used to be it was NATO enlargement that was threatening Russia. Well, yesterday Putin said to Finland and Sweden, you know, it's fine if you want to join NATO as long as there's no NATO infrastructure there and there are no foreign bases. And Sweden and Finland aren't interested in that anyway. So if you like, the goalpost keeps shifting, and this kind of vague concept that the Russians had in those treaties that they presented in December 2021, again about indivisible security, it all comes back to the same question of Russia believes that its security interests are only met if it can dominate its neighbors and possibly even, you know, Central and Eastern Europe. And if that's what it wants, there's going to be resistance to giving it that.
Yeah.
I will just quickly add that in 2012, I produced a documentary film about NATO and the addition of the Baltic states to NATO, along with my friend Andres Kesteris here, who's in the front row. And we did an interview with Russia's DCM to NATO, and I asked him directly, what sort of threat does NATO expanding into the Baltic states, what sort of threat does that pose? And he said, well, it's that infrastructure. We don't want to see that infrastructure creeping to Russia's border. And I asked him to specify what infrastructure he was referring to, and he said, well, there isn't any infrastructure now, but the infrastructure that will be there. So he couldn't identify any sort of infrastructure and couldn't quite identify that threat.
And that's also something that they said about Ukraine too, when they were trying to justify the context for invasion, was that, you know, okay, now today there's trainers, tomorrow there will be NATO infrastructure, and that will lead to, you know, NATO missiles being stationed in Ukraine, and that's a direct threat to Russia. But also, you know, I think the point about expansion, you know, this is about countries that have willingly elected to join NATO. You know, it's not NATO expanding its borders towards Russia. It's countries willingly choosing to join NATO. And, you know, you don't see countries lining up to join Russia's club or China's club or any of those kinds of things. So this is about nations' sovereign right to choose their own path. And I think, so amen to everything that Angela said. And I think, what I do worry about is less, well, firstly, it's shifting goalposts. I mean, yes, Russia has already said that, you know, the West pushing security assistance into Ukraine is already making them party to the conflict and has threatened to retaliate on those stances. And, you know, we haven't seen that so far yet. So there's a lot of bluster going on. But what I worry about more in terms of, you know, the possibility of World War III is an accident or some kind of spillover miscalculation. We've talked a lot about what happens if a bomb falls, that's headed towards Lviv and goes to the border of Poland, or something like that, where there's a miscalculation or an accident that could be considered potentially an Article 5 scenario. But I think a lot of what gets lost in some of the headlines too is that Article 5 isn't automatically triggered. Like, there is a process where leaders have to come together and discuss, what actually happened. Are we going to consider this Article 5? And that mechanism exists particularly for this reason, so that we can deconflict and talk about, potential accidents, so that we don't start World War III over something that truly was an accident. So I think we do have mechanisms in place to try and prevent, worldwide destruction over something like that. But that's kind of what I worry about more, is something unintentional happening on the borders of Ukraine.
Which is possible. Michael?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question about how do you achieve assurances or some degree of stability. And, you could say rather than assurances, maybe diplomatic back and forth. And I would simply say in this regard that if you go back over the last 12 months, look at all the opportunities that Putin moved past or didn't take up. So he had a summit with Biden in June of 2021 where there was a strategic stability dialogue that was set up, a mechanism between the two governments that could have achieved something. But while that was being set up, Putin was preparing for this war. And I think especially important in this conversation, I might myself have been a bit more receptive to some of Mearsheimer's arguments 12 months ago, but you have to factor in the 3 months prior to the war. So there was intensive diplomacy, and I think that the U.S. and other countries were willing to offer Putin something, maybe something equivalent to Ukraine's neutrality, whatever that would mean diplomatically. But Putin just blew right past that. And not only did he blow past it in terms of not being interested, not negotiating in good faith, the diplomacy was a series of lies. We're not building up, we're withdrawing, we're not going to invade. Putin is fundamentally untrustworthy. So you have to acknowledge that reality, even if one knows that Russia is a nuclear power and it's dangerous not to have more dialogue and maybe not have more compromise. You have what you have in Putin. And we're not going to be able to create somebody trustworthy out of somebody who isn't trustworthy. So I think we're left with two mechanisms now. I don't think diplomacy is going to take us anywhere. I just think that phase is over. I think we can do our best in our way to understand what Russia's true red lines are. They do a lot of bluster and confusing talk about that, but I think intelligence on Russia has been very good in the last couple of months. So surely you could use some of those tools to try to understand what are Russia's true red lines. You don't have to accept them at face value or live with them, but you should know what they are. And that helps, I think, in terms of avoiding the worst kinds of crisis. And then, and I think that this is happening, that there is some degree of conversation between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Patrushev, and between, I know that there was a call last week between Secretary Austin and Shoigu. So there is a bit of conversation, and that's a good thing. If you take the Syria conflict, the deconfliction there has helped to prevent misunderstandings and shoot downs of airplanes that could lead us in some accidental fashion in a very sort of dangerous direction. So you establish as much process as you can, the proverbial red phone that was there during the Cold War, to try to stave off the worst. But I think that's the best we can do. Figure out what their red lines are, have some degree of communication and process, and otherwise, there's just not much available.
I would also think that we should heed Gary Kasparov's warning when he's told us repeatedly that the West continues to play through with the playbook that, or rather the rule book that Vladimir Putin disregarded already years and years ago, and we have to start getting on the same page and recognizing that. Heather?
Yeah, one more thing, on the question of peaceful coexistence, and that was what was being tried to achieve in the Arctic for the last 3 decades, and was very close, as close to being successful in that regard as any other region, and that's been lost now. And I totally agree that until there's regime change, there's no opportunity for cooperation. But how do you make sure that when that regime change happens, whether it's 2036 or 3 months from now, that there is a pathway back to cooperation? And there's literature, and there were attempts, during the Cold War on functionalism, on having functional cooperation at a civil society level. So I think certainly in the Arctic, people will attempt this and try to do this and maintain this as some kind of scientific cooperation, for example, on climate change or environmental security, but trying to maintain some level with some Russians who would be more moderate, who could lead some ideological change in the country in the years to come, and not to isolate every single Russian, but only the ones that think that there's no value in rules-based order.
yeah, unfortunately, I think those moderates are all in prison right now, or soon to be. So.
Some of them are on the tundra looking at methane, and we want to engage with those ones.
I received a message from Lithuania's ambassador to Canada, Ambassador Skasevich. Ambassador.
I just wanted, if I may, to to make a comment. And thank you for the great panel. And it's really interesting to hear the view from North America. But and we are, I understand, on the record, so I'll try to be very polite and and to say only as much as I'm allowed to say. But you know, I think Lithuania, Baltic countries, and other countries in Europe also deserve security guarantees. And this is not a video game. This is not a strategic philosophical discussion on how to play, what's our next step. It's innocent people being killed in the middle of Europe. Innocent women are being raped in the middle of Europe, and cities being destroyed in the middle of Europe. And in our understanding, there is no way back from where we are now. And therefore, I would wish that Western friends would understand that our credibility is really at stake, and we should stop thinking finally about when sanctions will be lifted, when we will be able to do business again, who will get better stake at the table. Let's stop thinking like this, you know, and saying that you know, one of the top 5 countries in the world by energy resources might be able to export their resources to Europe in 3 to 10 years. It's not convincing. Like, we have to act now, because our credibility is at stake, and I really have a plea to everybody to stop thinking like you know, how to say, like, people are being killed, raped, cities are being destroyed, and European countries, small countries, they also want their security guarantees. We made this mistake a number of times. In 2008, with part of Georgia now being occupied, with 2014 and Crimea. By the way, photos of 2014 from Donbas area are very similar to the ones we are crying when we look from Bucha and other places. This is repeating. This is repeating again and again. Let's not be fooled by Russia, because there is no possibility for dialogue. They will fool us again with, okay, without Putin, next leader will promise that he will be different and we will lift all the sanctions, and in 5 years they will invade Arctic or any other place, you know. So, yeah, thank you. This is my comment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And as a Canadian Estonian, I'm biased and completely agree with you. You know, I think that the Baltic states, we should have been listening to them already in 1994, when Lennart Meri, the president of Estonia, gave a speech in Hamburg and warned us of the potential return, the revanchism of Russia, which was already rising back then. We ignored Meri back then. We ignored Estonia's, Latvia's, Lithuania's warnings in 2007, 2008 again, 2014. When do we really start taking the threat of Vladimir Putin seriously? And I don't.
I think we've taken it very seriously.
We are taking it seriously, but when do we start addressing it immediately as the ambassador has asked? Anyone?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that exact question, but I think Michael was right. This is not 2014. I think the West has woken up in many ways, not evenly across the board. Of course, we hear comments that are disturbing sometimes, in my view, from allied countries that are not as forceful as we should be against the Kremlin. But I do think this is a different environment fundamentally than where we were in 2014, and the swiftness with which the West has responded so far underscores that. I think it's a different environment. But to your point about, guarantees to smaller countries, I completely agree. I mean, obviously the Baltic states are already under the NATO umbrella, but I just wrote an article last week about the need, not just to push security assistance to Ukraine, but also to countries surrounding Ukraine. And, now that we've seen that how possible it is to push billions of dollars relatively quickly, and the support of the U.S. Congress, what that can do to speed up this process, there ought to be more multi-year flexible assistance that goes towards building up these capabilities, because a lot of that security assistance, not to get too technical, but it comes through the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, that comes every year. And by the time the money is appropriated, a lot of the countries only get like 9 months to spend the money. And so it's very difficult to invest properly and to plan ahead without having multi-year funding. So I think we're learning lessons about, how to do security cooperation and security assistance more effectively to plan for the longer term. So, that's something that we've been pushing for in Washington.
Anyone else?
I mean, this is not an adequate response, but it's just something that comes to mind when you mention Lithuanian politics. What we all have to reckon with is that Lithuanian politics is very different from US politics in relation to this crisis. And I would just point us to recent tweets from Donald Trump Jr. and Donald Trump himself, who said, "Why are we supporting Ukraine? This is the presumptive Republican nominee in 2024, and he's certainly the leader of his party." That's obviously not a factor in Lithuanian politics. You don't have anybody speaking in those terms, but the US does. If you look at France, you see quite a few parties that are anti-EU, anti-NATO. Italy is not different. So in these countries that are not Lithuania, that feel existential threats from what Russia is doing in Ukraine, we have to be especially vigilant and creative about making these arguments, because a lot of our population, I mean, just look, around here. I don't know if people are in the city of Ottawa, sort of deeply connected to what's happening on the territory of Ukraine. Many are, I'm sure, especially those of Ukrainian heritage and who have a personal connection to the region, but for many it may be very far away. So our political leaders have to be very, very smart about the domestic politics of it all, because I think it just can't be taken for granted in the US. I can't speak for Canada, but I know France and Italy also, even though Macron handily won re-election. I think Germany is actually pretty secure, and the UK is pretty secure, and that's of course good news. But there are some fractures that we want to be very aware of and sort of address as soon as possible. Any effective foreign policy, I think, begins with domestic politics in some ways.
Heather, a final word?
I would say, if the Baltic states want to hear a mea culpa, then here it is. On the Arctic, maybe we were naive, but I think it came from a place of expecting Russia to act in its own interests, and so what it's in our interest and Russia's interest to cooperate in the Arctic and to cooperate generally and economically, and expecting that they would also see that was in their own interests. And so now what has happened, where yes, in retrospect, maybe we were naive, but for Canada, it hasn't come at a cost, like it's come for a cost for those in Central Europe, is that we could not, either they're acting totally irrational or we just completely misjudge what they thought their interests were. And so we would not have predicted that they would act this way, even though you would have, because to us it's so contrary to what must have been in their interest. So that's what I think in the Arctic, where we thought we had common interests and we could pursue it, and it made sense for both of us. And it's just not that you trusted Putin, but you trusted that Russians' interests should be, prevalent in their foreign policy. And there was some naivety, certainly, in how we thought that Russia might pursue their own interests. So.
Wonderful. Thanks, Heather. We're running up on time right now at 11:52. Is there any concluding ideas, any final thoughts from anyone before we wrap up the panel?
I think just on the question of regime change or what comes after Putin, obviously we don't know and we don't know when, but we shouldn't necessarily assume that in the short run it'll be very much different. Because the people who surround him still very much apparently share his views of what's happening. And you would have to go to a different level already of potential successes where they might really understand that Putin will now have set back Russia's development by I don't know how many decades. We talked about they'll be living in the Brezhnev era. Putin wanted a seat at the table on all important international decisions. Well, he's made sure that that's not going to happen. But that won't happen quickly. And so, and you could also have a period of instability, if he, depending again on how he leaves power. So I think in the longer run, one can hope that it would produce a Russia that would act differently, but it's not necessarily going to happen anytime soon.
No, and I think the ultimate goal is to have some sort of popular uprising, have the people bring that change around rather than any other way around. And I think you're right, that we're a long way away from that. My old friend Boris Nemtsov used to say that it could be 2040, 2045 before anything like that could happen. And that's a long way away. And I think we need to assume that Vladimir Putin will remain there for some time, and that this sort of conflict, this cycle of conflict will continue, and we need to be prepared for that. Michael, last word?
I just wanted to pass the buck to the next panel to figure out what all of this means. What we've been discussing to figure out what all of this means for the Indo-Pacific, because I think that's crucial. So it's an appeal. We pass the baton to not to the next generation, but to you. But I would really love to see the implications of this worked out for this other part of the globe. Right.
Thank you all so much for your wonderful insights, and to MLI for hosting this, and the U.S. Embassy. And bon appetit. Enjoy lunch.
Thank you.